The following program is part 1 of 2 parts, each 90 minutes long. There is support material available at this website, including quizzes, handouts, and lecture outlines for all presentations. Consult the UCTV programming guide for the date and time part 2, and other lectures in the series will be shown.
Scott missed my introduction, and I always introduce myself as father of twin daughters. They just turned 13 last Sunday, and a avid or rabid fisherman, and when time permits, an extension weed ecologist at UC Davis. Most of my work is in vegetable crops, and when I say weed ecology, a lot of my work's in reduced chemical or non-chemical methods. And for master gardeners, I think that should be the primary emphasis, is in reduced chemical or non-chemical methods. And so to begin, I'm going to talk about methods to control weeds that deal non-chemically. And I'll give you examples as often as possible of some of these methods and how you can use them or how other people can use them. And think of where the best place to stand here to avoid being in anybody's line of sight. Maybe over here. Okay. Obviously, there's a lot of methods that can be used, cultural methods, and some of these are pretty obvious, as I've brought some of them here. Some maybe not so obvious, and so hopefully you'll have a chance to see how some of these work, and hopefully you'll think that some of them are useful. Okay. First off, cultivation. Obviously, I think everybody's done some cultivation, and this is how I got my first experience in weed control. When I was about 10 or 11, every summer we'd go to my grandmother's farm and stay there all summer long. And my job for 50 cents an hour was to go out and weed her garden. And her garden was a half an acre. It wasn't a small garden, so it wouldn't take me I couldn't finish in a day. It would take me days upon days, and by the time I finished at one end, I'd have to start back at the next end again. And one of the things that I learned is the smaller the weed, the easier they are to get out. And you could sort of think of that when you got a little bitty guy, how big are the roots? Not so big. As they get bigger, the roots get bigger. I mean, imagine a tree versus a little bitty seedling. In a sense, that's, you know, kind of a large range, but that's what you're dealing with. So the smaller, the better. Dry is also important. Why is that? Because these plants can reroot when you think about it. I mean, if you get into cultivating, as maybe some of you might have done this morning, maybe not, and then you just leave them at the surface, it rains and it reroots. Now, a crop plant, no way. I mean, but weeds always. They always reroot. And shallow, because where do weeds germinate? Right near the surface. Now, a crop is also a little different. If you put a crop seed down 5 inches, and you water it, it'll germinate because that's been bred out of it. Now, weeds are a little smarter. If it's not near the surface, they don't germinate. And it might be the oxygen, CO2 concentration, or brief exposure to light, or any of these things. So shallow is better. And this just shows sort of what I'm dealing with sometimes in a crop situation or a landscape situation. You come out there and you take out that weed with a hoe, no problem. A little bit later on, when those weeds get bigger, and you come and you take that same weed out, well, it's harder to get out because it's got a bigger root system. But then you also end up with what I call cultivator blight, where you've taken a little bit of the roots of the plant next to it with it. And so that plant, regardless of what it is, the desirable plant, and say it could be either one of those, obviously is going to be a little bit impinged. And so it's not going to be as competitive against the next cohort of weeds. So taking them out small is best. Also, when they're big and you don't take out the root systems, this is what can happen. And you know, they gave me a pointer here, and I already put it in my pocket or something. I don't care. Anyway, but you can see here that this thing here, it was taken off right at that point, and then it's going to grow a new top. So if you don't take off the top of a lot of weeds, they just keep growing back. And grasses for sure. I mean, otherwise, every time we mowed the grasses, they'd die. They don't die because the growing point's just below the surface. But broadleaves also have buds just below the surface that could send up a new top if you don't take the top off. And so this is the other thing my grandmother would tell me. Get the roots, because I just sort of chopped the top because it would be hard as rock, the soil, and it was difficult. Also, weeds germinate at the surface. Okay, so say you have a situation where you've eliminated most of the weeds by a shallow cultivation. If you've got most of the weeds and you've only gone shallow, you can see here that these weeds are all germinating. This is in centimeters, so this is an inch. You know, most of these optimum depth 1 inch or less. When they're germinating or 1 inch or less, if you cultivate deeper, say you rototill, it just brings up a whole new batch. And believe me, there's millions of seeds per acre. In a place where you think there's no weed seeds, there's millions. And so you're not going to eliminate all the seeds, but if you just keep going shallow, in fact shallower each time, less and less seeds are there that can germinate. And so I always recommend as shallow as possible. Or use something other than cultivation so you don't disturb that soil. If you can eliminate them, say with a flamer or something such as this, there's no soil disturbance at all. No new seeds come up. For perennial weeds, field bindweed, do you all know what field bindweed looks like? Morning glory? Perennial morning glory? This is perennial, not the annual morning glory. The annual morning glory has the nice blue flowers or pink flowers. The bindweed typically has white flowers. You see it along roadsides all the time. That's a perennial, very deep root systems. For a perennial, to cultivate that out, you've got to keep coming back. And imagine an iceberg. And an iceberg, how much of it's above the surface of the water and how much is below? It's like 10%, 15% above the water and 85% below the water. Okay, when you cut off the top of that iceberg, what happens? Floats up again. Well, in a sense, that's what you're trying to do with these perennials. You're trying to deplete that below ground energy supply. And by taking it out frequently, it doesn't have time to put anything back into that, and so you can eventually eliminate it. Now, I say eventually. I did this, and it took 17 times at about 2-week intervals. And that was probably a big root system, and I just methodically every 2 weeks would go and take that out. But you can get rid of these if you're persistent. Okay, my favorite part, hose. And I think far too many times people want an herbicide solution to how do I get rid of my weeds, you know, but the easiest way is don't let them get too far into your field and go out there with a hoe. And I brought several of these. If you had pure sand or such a soft soil, this might work well. But for anything other than that, like the hard soils that we typically have, the clays, this is not a good hoe. But I thought I'd bring it anyway. I have a hoe collection that I would say I probably have at least a dozen. Every time I see a new one, I always buy it so that I have a collection. And then I try it, because I want to be able to tell you this one works or doesn't work. Okay, a regular hoe often looks like this, but a little wider, right? Oh, why do you need it to be so wide? What's the advantage? By cutting it down, it's a lot lighter. And believe me, if you're doing this all day long, oops, sorry, it gets a little bit heavy. And so that's not such a good idea. So this is one that I bought, but you can cut down a regular hoe, sharpen it, and believe me, it'll work just the same. And if you're going around plants that have a sort of a rosette appearance that are real low to the ground, this allows you to get in and around underneath them a lot easier than a full length hoe. And you might say, well, I need that bigger blade because big weeds. Well, you can just put this on edge and do the same thing. Okay? That's not my favorite though. This is, and I think the next one, well, this shows a couple of these. This is my favorite right here. And this is what most people would call a hula hoe, but hula hoe is one of these generic terms like Kleenex. You know, Kleenex is really tissue paper, and Kleenex is a brand. Hula hoe is a brand. This is actually called a stirrup hoe, and this one's a Swiss made one, a real is the way they pronounce it. Real is the way I would pronounce it, R-E-A-L. And this one's the industrial grade hula hoe. And I guarantee you I could take this carpet up right this second. That's how sturdy it is. And the second feature, this is a small blade, 3.5 inch. You can get them 5 or 7 inch, bigger ones. I like the 3.5, again, for the same reason. You can get closer to the plants you're trying to protect and get those weeds that are real close to whatever that is. Also, check this out. Look at the handle length. I mean, it's the longest handle of all of my hoes by at least this, well, about that much. Smith & Hawkins makes good hoes, but not like this. The longer the handle, the less bending over you have to do and the less strain on your back. So again, longer handle hose make life a lot easier. And this I got at Peaceful Valley Farm Supply. It's in Nevada City, and but a number of places carry this type of hoe, and it's about the same price as any of the Smith & Hawkins hoes. It was about $25. Kind of an expensive hoe, but it's held up. I mean, nothing's gone wrong. And this thing, self-sharpening. And these hoes here, I'll tell you a little story. I gave my grandfather one of these hoes. He's 95. And actually, I gave him a hula hoe, which is a much cheaper version of these. Hula hoes are about $10. And they're made to go like this, because you go one direction, and the blade's this angle. When you pull back the other way, the angle of the blade changes. He thought something was wrong. He welded it. So, you know, they're made to be like that. You might tell people if they have them that that's not a defect. How long do you need to keep weeds out in a garden situation? Not very long. And you can see here that this is just how long we kept weeds out. In other words, from the time we planted, how long? Only about 6 weeks and everything goes well. If you keep them out longer, yields go down. Now, why would yields go down? Disturb the roots? Disturb the roots. Just like I was showing you earlier about that sort of cultivator blight. When you take weeds out, even late in the year, even when you pull them out, the roots are already interconnected, and you end up disturbing some of the roots of the crop. And so in some ways, you're almost better off to cut those rather than try to pull them out. Even though they'll grow back, you won't lose so much yield. That's just kind of something to keep in mind, too. This one basically shows the same thing, except that it also shows the weeds, the blue bars and the purple being cabbage. And you can see that if you keep them out just a couple weeks, they're hardly going to produce anything. So it's really not important to keep them out forever. And in fact, in my yard, I've decided to let them grow. Okay, biocontrol. Now, most of you are not going to deal too often with biocontrol in the classical sense. In other words, using insects or disease to control weeds. Yellow star thistle, there are, through CDFA, biocontrol agents that they release to control weeds. But for the most part, master gardeners do not deal with that. But these guys, if you ever have an orchard or a vineyard and you want to control grasses and even perennial grasses, geese are natural grass eaters. And it doesn't matter what variety of geese. It could be Canadian geese, or in this case, these are Ebdens, which are, they get to about 30 pounds. Really, really good grass eaters. Very specific to that. And here's another kind. This is African geese, and here they are in artichokes. And that's far more than you actually need. You only need about 4 to 6 per acre. You got a question?
So you could put them in a vegetable garden where there was like a perennial grass problem, and they would prefer to eat the perennial grass?
I'll show you that in just a second, I believe. Yes, that's a good question. They will eat grasses over almost anything else, naturally. And I think I have a picture of that. Here they are in tomatoes, and these are my geese. And you can see in the background, they were just there. This is a fence, not to keep them in so much, it's just to keep dogs and other predators out. If you get these at day old, which is the way I get them, they hatch them, they incubate them, hatch them. They don't see anything until they see you when you open the box as day olds, and they imprint on you. And so they're just like a dog or cat. They will stay right where you go, and you can lead them from area to area. Just come on, guys, and they will follow you. And they become just like any other pet, just like any other domestic pet at least. And so they're pretty easy to train. and they will eat grasses. And in a wet area or an area like right now, when it's too wet to get any kind of machinery in, they're perfect because they love it. It's wet. The things they don't like, when it's really hot, they need to be in shade, so they could only work in early morning, late evening during the summer. They have to have water, and you can see I have a bucket there, that 5-gallon bucket, to give them drinking water. If you put a pool out, they'll spend all day sitting in the pool and not eating. And so you've got to be thinking about giving them shade to avoid the heat, because obviously they have a down coat, and heat is the big thing. Some people clip one wing or both wings to keep them from flying. I've never done that. And they'll fly out of their pen, and then they'll be in the morning, you'll see them, and they'll try to be flying back in. They don't really want to go anywhere. And again, it's like a domestic animal. Where are they going to go? They're not going to take off with the Canadian geese. They want to stay right there with the rest of their group and with you, who's basically, to them, the mother goose. And so they're pretty good about staying. When there's no grass, though, you need to supplement their feed, because if they have no grass and you leave them in there with the tomatoes, they're not going to starve to death. They will eat the tomatoes. And as the fruit starts turning red, they will eat it. Now, almost always, they'll take a bite of just about anything to try it. But they typically don't eat too much. Now, some people say, aren't they kind of mean? And they will be mean as they get older. But not to you, to everybody else. To you, you're the important one, and everybody else is something else. But a geese, I mean, they have no teeth, and so they flap their wings, and it's mostly bluff, and that's what they're hoping for. They're not really something you've got to be fearful of. They can't hurt you. When they pinch you, that's about the most they can do. So babies are best, young ones. As they get older, they're less interested in eating and more interested in sex and fighting. And so younger ones are best. And what I try to do is get ones as babies, let them grow for about a year, and then go ahead and give them to somebody, because every one of mine have been named by my daughters, and so there's no way that I could give them to somebody who might eat them. And so all of mine have become pets somewhere, and organic farmers who are vegetarians primarily. And this just shows how they've done in some studies. You can see here's the control, basically, and this is weed cover through time, and basically a lot of weeds. Here's chickens. Chickens don't eat too much. They'll eat some seeds, and they, by scratching, looking for insects, they scratch out some weeds, but they're not too good on weeds. And then the geese, and you can see what they do to the weed cover. They can do a very good job of eliminating weeds. Yes?
Will they eat dried grasses, or does it have to be green?
They prefer green by far. Dried grasses, not really. Green is what they prefer.
Useful in your lawn, or to mow your lawn, or would they kill the lawn?
Well, I'll just give you my experience. When I start with day olds, I put them in my yard. And I have a dog and cats, but dogs and cats, they seem to know that these are also pets because you brought them home, and they don't mess with them, even though my dog's a bird dog. And with 10 little goslings starting at day old, my lawn was nothing but goose crap after about 2 weeks. And I mean, literally, they had not just mowed it, but almost eliminated it. I wouldn't say they're very useful in the yard, because obviously, if you've ever been out of the golf course where they have a lot of geese problems, it's the manure that's the difficult thing. They're more useful in orchard or vineyard or someplace where you're not too concerned about the manure problem. Yes?
What about broadleaf weeds, thistles, and other things like that?
They'll do very well with geese in there, because they're going to knock out all the grass competition, so they're not too good at that. You can train them. You can train them to eat broadleaf plants by feeding these plants to them as babies. And how many of you do not like your mother's cooking? I mean, almost everybody does. It's because that's what you've gotten used to. And so if you're fed that from day one, you get used to that and you'll eat that. So you could actually train them to eat almost anything. But grasses, that's the natural. They will eat grasses always. They'll eat corn. They'll eat any grasses that you plant also. So it isn't just grasses that you want to get rid of. Any grass, even the ones you might plant. And this just shows the advantage of getting rid of weeds. You know, the chickens didn't do too well. You can put chickens, geese, and ducks together, and if they grow up together, they'll stay together as a flock as if they're all one species. Same as dogs and cats that live together. They learn to get along real well.
Can I ask you about weed control using pesticides, like in vineyards, they generally do a 2-foot strip? Would that affect the geese?
Well, because the weeds are eliminated by the pesticide, not really. And they're not like a cat that licks themselves and so on, you know, licks their paws and then cleans their face. And so they don't really ingest the pesticides to too much extent. I would keep them out, just like I would keep out any livestock out of an area that's just been treated until, you know, such time as maybe a couple weeks to let that dry down and die off. But it wouldn't hurt them. And they're used that way at times in some of the vineyards over in the Napa Valley and Mendocino. They're used in conjunction with herbicides that are treated in strips to keep the weeds out of the centers. Cattle, wheat, yellow star thistle, and I'm not going to touch on this too much because Joe DiTomaso, who will come a little later, will talk about yellow star thistle. But cattle can be used, and goats are good brush eaters. And sheep eat everything down to ground level. Goats are more browsers, and they're pretty good on shrubs, and they'll eat almost anything, even spiny things. What, excuse me? Oh, well, goats eat blackberry bushes. Yes, they will, even the spines, if they're kept in those areas. They'll eat, I mean, even things such as gorse, which are very spiny. They'll nibble on those quite a bit, if you can find them to that area. I don't know how they do it. Yes?
Are you done with the animals?
You
didn't say anything about sheep. I wondered if sheep were good for you.
Sheep are very good for almost everything. In fact, you very rarely see yellow star thistle in a sheep pasture because they nibble everything right down to the ground level and are very effective at keeping. Yeah. They'll eat. Well, they're less effective on the shrubby species than they are the herbaceous species. You know, the annual species.
Are the sheep better than goats, or goats better than
Goats are better than sheep for shrubs and more the perennial species that are coming up from established root systems. Goats are better for poison oak, definitely. Mulches is, for master gardeners, this should be one of the mainstays for weed control. All you have to do is just mulch ground, and most weeds won't germinate, annual weeds. Perennial weeds doesn't work too well, but annual weeds, very effective at keeping the weeds out. I like to use organic mulches rather than synthetic mulches because I'm a weed ecologist, and I mean, even though plastics are considered organic, are they? It's a petrochemical product. It's the same as Roundup or anything else as far as I'm concerned. It doesn't break down in the CO2 and water. You know, it's not too dissimilar from many of the chemicals we use. So I prefer organic mulches. Although black plastics, because they keep all light out, work pretty well. The only species they don't work on is sedges, because sedges have those pointy stems as they come up and they can poke right through. Also, weeds coming up around these little holes that you create can be a real hassle. I think I have a picture of that. Well, this just shows different kinds of mulches. Now these are made out of recycled products, and they're porous. And so water goes through, doesn't sit on top as the black plastic does. With black plastic, you almost have to have a drip line underneath. With these type, the water can move through, so they work a little better in that regard. Kind of pricey, though. This is one of the big problems, getting rid of the weeds that come up in your planting holes there. You know, and how do you deal with that? And here's another problem, degradation of your plastics caused by ultraviolet light. Now, a lot of them have ultraviolet inhibitors, but they don't keep it out forever, and so you still end up with some degradation. So a lot of times you put wood chips on top. Well, this is black plastic, or well, this is bark mulch only, but right in the background is the same thing, plastic with bark mulch on it. Look what happens. After a while, dust and everything accumulate. Plants can germinate in that little soil, and then pretty soon it's almost as if you had no mulch at all, regardless of whether you have plastic or not. And they will be able to, their roots can penetrate through. Now you hear about this with bamboo, but almost any of these things will do it. This is one of the mulch systems that I've been working with, and
What is that? What is that mulch?
that's just a oats that were just mowed and laid over in place, and then tomato transplants put right into that. I don't use that. I usually use leaves or lawn clippings or something like that. Sometimes I'll use just organic waste that I have from my compost pile that isn't perhaps completely composted, and even that works pretty good.
Wouldn't the flies bug your tomato plants though?
Not if it's pretty well far along in terms of the composting. Solarization. Okay, there was a question asked about solarization. How does that work? Well, basically, uses clear plastic during the summer months, and it'll kill almost that whole top layer. And here it describes it a little better. You basically cultivate to get the ground to nice, uniform conditions. You level it, you water it, lay the tarp over, and the sun does the rest. Clear plastic, and I'll talk about that in a second. These two steps are very important, leveling and watering, and then laying the plastic tight. I think I show that. Now, why are those important? Why would leveling and watering be so important for solarization? To get the what? Watering is to get the heat up. That's pretty darn close, and it's actually correct, but it's, when you think about it, by leveling and putting that plastic real tight, you've eliminated air spaces, because air is a poor conductor. And so by having water and that thing tight, you heat up the soil a lot more, and the heat moves down into the soil. The second thing it does is that solarization will not kill dry weed seed. It kills germinating weed seed. By having moisture and warm temperature, those seeds germinate, and that's what's killed, is those seeds just as they germinate. Now this shows the temperature underneath that tarp, and this is the temperature under the tarp, and 60 degrees, say about 140 degrees. Here's the air temperature, and it shows it at about 40, which is maybe 105 degrees. And here's the no mulch condition. And this is at 4 centimeter depth right here. This is the air temperature. Here's 4 centimeter depth. How frequently does it get to 105 here? How often? Not very. I'd bet any of you that it gets 105 far more than what you might imagine. Because this is measured right at the surface. This isn't the weather channel at 4.5 feet temperature. And if you measure it right at the surface, in fact, how many of you ever laid out in the sun to get a suntan? You get pretty warm, right? Because right at that surface, there's no boundary layer. That's the boundary layer, excuse me. And there's no air movement. As you get higher, there's a little bit of air movement. As you get lower, closer to the ground, there's less and less air movement. Right at the surface, there's hardly any air movement. Things heat up very quickly there. And in fact, at Forest Hill, I don't know if you know where that's at, but it's just a little further up north. I did my master's work, and I looked at the ecology of ponderosa pine and these things, and trying to get regeneration of these conifer species. I measured 150 degrees at the soil surface on a dark soil surface, because it had been after a fire. That was one of the site preparation methods. And so, and that air temperature that day was right around 100. And that's how much of a difference you can get just in that distance. That's why you often hear hot enough to cook an egg on the pavement.
Can this method be used to eliminate, like, Bermuda grass or something that has underground
The question is, could it help to eliminate Bermuda grass? Absolutely. And the reason is because even though it's actually it's called stolons, which are stems, but below ground stems, they're always near the surface. You rarely see Bermuda grass being very deep, and so Bermuda grass is one of the few perennials you can get rid of. And in fact, in those conditions, what we typically do is, instead of rototilling it, is just try to get that plastic real tight and right against it. And we don't even make furrows, just as tight as you can get the plastic, water, put it on, leave it on during the summer months. That's the critical thing, and you can kill Bermuda grass. 95%, which is just as effective as any other method we have, chemical or otherwise. This is sort of what shows up after it's been solarized and an area next to it not been solarized. Now, not 100% effective because some weeds, they just can withstand that high temperature, have very high heat tolerance. And some of our shrub species, the ceanothus and some of the others here, they require fire or real high heat just to germinate. And without some sort of heat stimulation, they don't even germinate. So in a foothills type of area where you might have native shrubs, that might stimulate germination instead of eliminate the plants. Yes?
I have a question about how long it takes for the bugs to repopulate the area, earthworms and other things.
Not very long. That's a good question. How long does it keep earthworms and other of those critters from repopulating? And basically what we found is that microorganisms within 24 hours of the treatment have already gotten back into it and have already reached normal levels within about a week. And so microorganisms pretty quick. The earthworms and things, they move down in the soil profile to avoid that, because obviously if you're a little warm, you move down. If you're a little cold or a little flooded, you move up. And so they move depending on temperature. So earthworms are right back. And the thing that happens with these type of conditions is a lot of organic matter has been created by things dying off. And so earthworms are quick to get back to take advantage of that. And this just shows the impact of onions that were solarized and onions that were not. And this isn't just a fact of the weeds being killed. This is also disease, nematodes, insects that are also knocked out, because these are both weed-free conditions. And so obviously it was more than just the weeds that helped these onions do well. Crop competitiveness. Most people don't think, well, how would this fit? You know, because most of the situations you're dealing with as master gardeners aren't big, giant 100-acre fields. But you can still do some of these things. Planting geometry. If you have real wide spacing between anything, there's obviously a lot of room for weeds to grow. Planting rate, say you're planting a lawn. If you plant at the low end of the seeding rate, well, you've got more gaps there. If you plant at the high end of the seeding rate, even though it's cost more for seed, more crop competitiveness. I don't know if I have a slide to show that or not. Well, this just shows lettuce and how it could be planted. Again, this is kind of one of my examples from a large field, but still, I plant my garden pretty tight, a lot tighter than most people would guess. And I find this allows the plants to sort of develop that canopy quickly, and then pretty soon I don't have to mess with weeding. That's my goal always. And then transplants, and that's what this shows here. You get started with transplants, and that works a whole lot better than starting from seed. In an area like this, if you start from seed, you're already behind. You know, you really need to get as much of the summer as possible. And so right now, you should have already had your seeds started in a little flat in your window or something to really take advantage of the full year. Now this is a cotton field, and I took this picture because this was a mistake. But what they did is they planted it, and they forgot, and they went and planted it again, and planted it in different directions. But it just shows one way, if you are going to plant things, to make things more competitive by trying to get good, quick canopy closure. And so even though it's a mistake, from one perspective, it's pretty good. I didn't point out, there was some other studies on dandelion, and they show if you planted 10 pounds per acre of seed versus 20 pounds, less dandelion. But also variety differences. Some varieties do very well and will be very competitive. Others, even though they may look nice down in Salinas or some other location, may not do so well up here. And so Farm Advisor, Lynn, or others, they do all these variety trials. What does well in these conditions? I mean, use that information to figure out which ones to plant, because even though it may be a great tomato that tastes really good, it may not do very well in this location. And so try to pick ones that do well. Irrigation. This is some work that I did about 15 years ago when water was in short supply, and it'll probably be in short supply again several more times. Looking at how irrigation influences weeds. And basically, each of these are with and without an herbicide. This is buried drip below the surface. This is what I do now in our landscape. Now, why would I want to do that in a landscape situation in my yard? There's no evaporation because it's below the ground. I've eliminated that, so I've eliminated that water loss, so it's more efficient. But there's a second reason. I'm a weed person now, so think of, you know, it has to be a weed reason here. Otherwise, why would I have even brought this up? I'm not watering the surface. The surface is dry during our summer months. And if most of the weeds are coming up from seed and they germinate near the surface, if that water's down deep and the surface is dry, they can't germinate. And so I've kept that surface dry, and therefore I have very few weeds coming up. Now in a furrow situation or with sprinkler, you're watering everything. And that water sits there, and basically the weeds germinate pretty well. Let's see, sprinklers, if you really want weeds to grow well, use a sprinkler system. I mean, most times when you're germinating a crop, you use sprinklers because it gets the crop to nice uniform moisture. The crop germinates best that way. But weeds really are very similar to any crop that you might plant or any vegetation. They grow real well when you have a sprinkler system, but the weeds grow just as well. This just shows the results of that study that I did, and here's furrow, sprinkler, and subsurface drip, and you can see it further on here. This is without an herbicide, this is with an herbicide, but for us, master gardeners, we probably should just be thinking without the herbicide. And you can see it didn't matter with or without an herbicide here, the red or the pink, just very low weed numbers. And the only reason there was any weed numbers at all is because sometimes the water, we'd put too much on and it would sub up near the surface and a few weeds would get started right there. So we did have some weeds. And then there's also a yield advantage. You get more yield. And it's not just in relation to the weeds. When you think about it, whether you use drip at the surface or drip below the surface, how frequently do you water those plants? Every day practically, or every other day, fairly frequently. When you use sprinkler or furrow irrigation, you water a lot less frequently, typically. Okay? When you water less frequently, what happens to those plants? Well, right after you water, things are growing real well. And then as things go along, they grow less and less and less well until you water again, and they start back that cycle. So it's sort of a cyclic pattern between irrigations where you get good growth after an irrigation and poor growth right before the next irrigation, and good and then bad. Whereas with drip systems, nice uniform growth all the way along, your crops usually mature a few days earlier, and you also get more yield. And so there's other advantages to using drip. Good question. The question was, have I had problems maintaining a berry drip system? Well, there are a couple, and sometimes you hear about insects eating the lines, or squirrels or ground squirrels eating the lines. Well, you can tell real quickly when something's eating the line, because everything past a certain point is suddenly wilted, and then right at that point you also find a big wet area. You have to dig it up, put a little piece of line in there, and put a little wire around it, and put it together, and start it back up again, and everything's back to normal. Most of the time you hear about root intrusion too, but you keep a positive pressure on these and roots don't grow in. Emitters can clog with low quality water, and that's where the muric acid comes in. But it really reduces water use, and as you mentioned, the 76 drought or any of the drought situations, it can really be useful. And if water's expensive, and if you're having to pump water right now and energy is expensive, especially if that water level or water table is deep, this is something to think about. Even if it isn't berry drip, at least drip to save water. Dust mulches. This is a garden type of thing, and this is often a good way to plant. Basically, you irrigate, cultivate shallowly, and then plant your seed down deep. This is corn, beans, large seeded things, squash, any kind of plants, or transplants all work well. I think I got some pictures here. Irrigating. And I'm sorry, most of my examples are agriculture, but that's my background. So, but irrigating like this, The weeds come up real thick. Cultivating, and again, this is a very shallow cultivation, and moisture's still down there about 2 inches, and then you plant your seed down deep, and then the plants come up without any further irrigation. But the weeds, because that soil is real dry at the top, don't germinate. Crop rotation, not something that very important for most gardens. Although I always tell people, don't plant your tomatoes or your other plants in the same areas every year. If you do that, they're always using the same nutrients, the same problems come up year after year, and eventually that's no longer a very good area. Always move your gardens around when you're planting a garden to take advantage of different spots. Flamers. Again, I love these. Flamers, there's some real satisfaction to seeing that weed just die right in front of your eyes. Now, when you're using a flamer, you don't need to turn them to charcoal. Basically, it goes from a glossy to a matte finish, just like a photograph. Once it turns to that matte finish, the membranes have been disrupted, they've been killed, and the plant wilts and dies. It may not be black yet. Fuel costs, particularly now, propane, you know, it's not free, but it's still a good organic method. And as I say, there's some real good feelings about seeing that weed die, and most people like that. And that's most homeowners. Well, I'll give you my brother is a good example. About 5 years, or probably 10 years, I guess now, he asked me, hey, can you get me some Roundup? Oh, sure, I can get that for you. So I got him a gallon of Roundup, and he lives down in Arizona. Hell, the next year he says, hey, can you get me another gallon? What? That's enough to kill your whole yard for 10 years. What do you mean? He says, must have been a bad batch. What do you mean? He says, well, I put, just like you said, a couple teaspoons in a gallon. I sprayed it, and nothing happened, you know? He says, so I put a little bit more, a little bit more. He says, I had to put almost full concentration to kill it. What he was doing, he wanted instant death. Well, these herbicides take a little bit of time. And so finally he was putting so much in that, you know, the plant was probably just from the weight of the Roundup was enough to die. And a lot of people want to see that instant death. Well, a flamer will give it to them. And so there's some things to be said for that. Here's a commercial flamer. And you can see doing this right at dusk or dawn allows you to see the flame. If you try to do it at midday, it's almost clear and you can't really tell where the flame is. Here's my flamer, and just a handheld. I have a 5-gallon tank. You can get 1 1/4 and 2 1/2. Those are the ones that I would recommend, because how long do you want to carry a 5-gallon tank around? Not very long. And even though you can't tell, that flame is on. This is midday. And so that's why I say early morning or evening is the best time, because then you can see the flame. You hear it. It sounds like a jet plane taking off. This is something that I've done. Say you have peppers or a real slow germinating vegetable, and you plant that in the ground and you water it to get it growing. And all kinds of peppers, bell peppers or hot peppers or any kind of peppers, take 3 weeks to come out of the ground. Well, that can work to your advantage, because all the weeds come up. And just when I first start to see that pepper just about to come out of the ground, I flame right over the top. Now, if I'd gone through and cultivated, what would I have done? I'd disturbed the little seedling peppers. I wouldn't have been able to get right in the row, and then I'd bring new seeds to the surface. But by flaming, I basically didn't bring any new seeds to the surface and allowed it to come up through a nice, clean condition. Organic herbicides. Vinegar. How many of you ever tried vinegar? For weeds? All right. How did it work?
Vinegar works good, and also alcohol, just plain rubbing alcohol in water.
Rubbing alcohol. Hadn't thought of rubbing alcohol, but okay. Vinegar, I think, is one of those seldom used things that most people have in their house. And when I mention to organic groups. When I talk to a group of organic farmers or something and I mention, how many of you have pesticides in your house? Not one of them raised their hand. How many of you have vinegar? Most people raise their hand. Well, that's an herbicide, or it can be used for herbicide. And I use, distilled vinegar, 5% acetic acid. Here's in my yard, and you can see there's the field bindweed, or the perennial morning glory, some people call it. And there's spurge. And I sprayed it. You can see it's sort of damp there. I sprayed it. And here it is a little later. The spurge is gone. And here's the bindweed. Now, the bindweed being a perennial, all I've done, just sort of like the poison oak, I've burned the top off. And I could have done that with a flame or anything else. It'll come back. The spurge is gone because it's an annual. And I've eliminated it. Now, under cold conditions, it doesn't work so well. But when it's really warm, vinegar works pretty good on small weeds.
What concentration of vinegar do you use?
Straight out of the bottle. 5%. In fact, you can buy what's called glacial acetic acid, which is 99.9% acetic acid. Kind of dangerous, just like any acid. You don't want to pour it on your pants or anything, but you could then dilute that. And that stuff you can get for a 2.5 liter, a little over a half a gallon of it, 3/4 of a gallon, you can get for $6. Or even at Costco, buying that 1 gallon is about $1.50. And so I buy the glacial acetic acid and cut it down to, oh heck, I've done experiments where I've used 10% instead of the 5%, and 10% even works on pretty good sized weeds. And so, glacial, like a glacier. It's not from a glacier. I checked on that because I was thinking, are we eliminating glaciers just to make acetic acid? But I don't know why. But any chemical supply place will have it. And you don't need any special permit. It's not used to make illegal drugs, so they're not going to be, the DEA won't be after you if you have it. Okay, prevention. This is pretty important. Don't let weeds come in. And this avoid letting weeds go to seed is pretty important because once they go to seed, 1 year seed is 7-year weed, is what you often hear. And that they'll last in the soil a long time. Some weeds can last much longer than 7 years. And so they can be a problem forever. You'll never eliminate all weeds because there's already seed in that soil. But there's no sense in letting it get worse by letting more seed get into there. Borders, field edges, that's where most weeds first come in. And I've got a border problem right now with my neighbors behind me. They've got Bermuda grass and it's coming under the fence. So that's my border problem. And then this equipment thing. One of the kids in my neighborhood, now he's no longer a kid, he's 25, but he used to mow my lawn. And, I like supporting neighborhood kids. I'll let him mow my lawn. I don't really want to mow my lawn anyway. And he'd come in and he'd mow my lawn. After a while, I start noticing two things: Bermuda grass and then rust in my yard. I have a ryegrass lawn, and the Bermuda grass bothered me the most. I'm thinking, where are these things coming from? And because I know weeds, I could see a seedling, and I'm pretty good about getting them out by pulling them out. And so anyway, I started checking, and I noticed one of my neighbors had a ton of Bermuda grass. And he would mow their lawn and then come mow mine. And on his lawnmower, you know how sort of the grass sort of hangs up on the top of the thing and then falls out and everything? He was putting Bermuda grass and rust into my yard. All he had to do, and I told him this, squirt it down with a hose. And that'll take care of the disease problem as well as the seed problem for the most part. And by just doing that little step, I eliminated that problem from coming into my yard. And so the other thing is compost. If it's truly composted, no problem. If it's not composted well, some weed seeds will survive. And so whenever I make all my own compost, so I don't have any problem. But sometimes cities, like the city of Davis where I live, they give out compost. All the lawn clippings and stuff. Well, lawn clippings and trees and stuff, trees don't have to worry about, but lawn clippings, if they have Bermuda grass or crabgrass or some of these other things, you better make certain that's really well composted, because if it's raw, if it hasn't been composted well, hasn't been turned and heated and so forth, some seed can survive. So you need to be a little cautious about that. Okay, I will mention turf. One of my friends gave me this slide who deals a lot with turf. And choose the right species. Mowing height. If you mow it too low, you oftentimes have more gaps. He's taught me that. If you mow it high, crabgrass, things like that can come in. I always set my lawnmower to about a 2-inch height. And so I have a pretty tall lawn normally. Uniform irrigation, because if you have dry spots or wet spots, it's going to favor plants other than the grasses. And I'll mention one story about that fertilize the turf, not the weeds. When I first moved into my house about 15 years ago, the people that moved out left all kinds of things in the garage. And one of them was this thing, a bag that said fertilizer on it. They just written on it fertilizer, and there was no tag on it. So I thought, well, I'm just going to use it up. So I go out there and a little whirly thing and whirl this stuff around. And anyway, about a week later, my wife says, something's happening to the flower beds. What do you mean? She says, I don't know, take a look. And I could see these patterns, these whirl patterns of death. It was weed and feed, but they just put fertilizer. So when you use weed and feed, make certain that, you know, where you put that stuff. Also, weed seed can live a long time, so we've got good job security as weed scientists. You know, we're not going to eliminate all these weeds. Now, you wonder, who did these studies? 1,700 years, you know, I don't know. But anyway, weeds can live a very, very long time in the soil. So don't ever think 1 year's treatments and your weed problems are gone. They'll be back, guaranteed. Okay, herbicides. As much as I don't like to use them, a lot of people want, how do I kill this weed or that weed? And sometimes herbicides is the easiest method. When you have a large area with a lot of weeds, to tell people go out there with hand weeding or some other cultural method, it may not be practical. And sometimes you can kill plants pretty easily with a very little, very selective herbicide. And so sometimes herbicides are the best solution. My yard's so small I could kill everything by hand, but sometimes large pastures, whatever, that isn't always practical. Or for some species like willows or poison oak or pyracantha or bamboo, I mean, to dig those out or take those out by hand is a lot of work. So I'll get into the herbicides. Basically, for an herbicide to work, 3 things have to happen. It has to get moved into the plant. Enough of it has to be moved to wherever it's going to exert that toxic effect, and then has to exert that toxic response. If any one of those 3 things don't happen, it doesn't work. And the last thing you want to do is use an herbicide and not have it work, because then you have to do something again. And so in a sense, you've just put in a toxic into the environment for what? You know, there's no real advantage to it. So every time you use an herbicide, you want it to work and work really well. 2 types, pre-emergence and post-emergence. The pre-emergence kill weeds, as it implies, before they emerge. Post-emergence, after they emerge. Roundup is the post-emergence. Things like surflan, treflan, these pre-emerge that you get, crabgrass killers, they're pre-emergence. Anyway, the pre-emergence have to be put on and incorporated either by rainfall or mechanically. They don't kill weeds that are already up, already out of the ground. And so if the weeds are already up, you're basically wasting your time. My neighbor tried to kill crabgrass with this crabgrass killer he bought. The crabgrass was already up. Well, it killed anything that would have come up, but since it was already up, it didn't do anything. And that's because, as you'll see, it has to be absorbed by the roots. And if the roots are down below that zone, it doesn't work. This sort of shows it diagrammatically. In this particular case, you can see the herbicide with the red dots and the seeds there, and it's probably going to absorb it through that hypocotyl area. It doesn't always have to be the roots, but it has to be that sort of succulent tissue. It has to be able to absorb that. And in some cases, if it's too deep, you may kill the wrong plant. You may kill the plant you're trying to save, and the one above it survives. And so you need to be a little cautious about how you use an herbicide. Several things, if you look at a label of any herbicide, they tell you apply this in, say, 10 to 40 gallons of water per acre, and incorporate, usually, and timing. In other words, timing before the weeds emerge. How do you decide about water volume when they give you such a wide range? Well, if you have a nice uniform soil surface like this, well, then a low water volume, just because you don't want to be carrying around 40 gallons of water if you're spraying an acre. You'd rather be carrying a small amount. And so you don't need a large amount if you have a nice uniform soil surface. And you can get easy uniform coverage like this. But what happens when you have a cloddy surface? A higher volume works a little better. With a cloddy surface, though, I can tell you, you have a harder time getting good uniform coverage. And you can look at these clods, and after you irrigate for a little bit, you know, you put that herbicide on. Basically, you put it on, and here's, say, that clod, and it's all over this surface, and that clod breaks in half. Well, the herbicide is down here. Now, here's a little seedling coming up into that clod. And so it's hard to get good uniform coverage. So I use higher volumes when you have cloddy soil, and low volumes when you have nice flat soil. This is what can happen to an herbicide once it's applied. I mean, here's the herbicide. It could volatilize. And sometimes you see herbicides like 2,4-D, which any homeowner can get, and yet is a restricted pesticide for agriculture. And so, but you can go down to Kmart or Walmart or Home Depot or any of these places, and you can Fisco, and you could buy 2,4-D. Be real careful with this, because on a hot day you apply that, and even if you apply it right to the plant, protected and everything, it volatilizes, can kill plants around it. And so you've got to be cautious with volatile herbicides. Some of these photochemically degrade, no problem with these things. This is what you want in some ways. You don't want them to last forever. Leaching. Right next to water systems, things such as that, you want to be a little cautious. You don't want to put it near a well. They can get down in the well. This is what you want, plant uptake, weed uptake. Okay, when I say incorporation, if you put it on the soil surface, as is done here, well, it took so much rainfall, about 8 inches of rainfall here before you got 100% control, and then it got pretty good control. If it was mechanically incorporated, you got good control, and then it starts to decline. Well, what's happening there? First off, what's happening here when it's put on the surface? What's going on? Why do you get no weed control there? It's on the surface. It has to be down where the plant can absorb it. The roots, in this particular case. Okay, it took so much water to leach it into that zone to where it can germinate, or excuse me, where the roots can take it up. And then finally, it's working pretty good. Well, what happened here? Why is that declining now when you incorporated it mechanically? For the same reason, because now it's leaching down a little deeper. Initially, say it was in that top 2 inches of soil, and now it's in the top 4 inches of soil. Or when it's in the top 4 inches of soil, you've now reduced your concentration to half. And all these things tell you it takes so much to kill this weed or that weed. And when you dilute it in half, it no longer has the same effectiveness. So that's what's happening there. It's leaching down a little bit. Now, this is kind of an interesting one. And it doesn't matter what these herbicides are, but this is drip system, and this is a sprinkler system. And this is applied in the winter, and then they're measuring this in an orchard situation where they've done like the rows, as was mentioned previously. And you often see this where the rows are nice and clean of weeds, and in between they have certain types of vegetation. Well, which do you think, I'm going to show a slide, the next one will be in October. Which do you think lasts the longest? Sprinkler, micro sprinkler, or drip? Which of these under which condition would an herbicide last longer? It's going to last longer in a drip. How many think drip? How many think sprinkler? Sprinklers win. Think of your compost pile. Have you gotten a talk on compost yet? Think of your compost. How does a compost work? When that's dry, are things composting? When it's wet is when it's composting. Well, a drip, you drip, emit daily or every other day. A sprinkler, a lot less frequently. And so in between those sprinklings, it's dry. And when it's dry, the microorganisms aren't working. Herbicides break down two ways, microbially or chemically. When it's chemical degradation, it's hydrolysis. In other words, it takes water. When it's microbially, it's just like a compost pile. It takes water. So the more water you put on a system, the more degradation you have. If you leave it dry, the herbicides can stay there a long time. So if you want to get rid of herbicides, say you spill some, water it, aerate it, just like you would a compost pile, and that'll help degrade it. Add organic matter. Get that microbial population really working hard, and they will eat up this stuff. They use it as a food source. And sometimes people say, well, what happens when you apply it to the microorganisms? Well, some benefit to the detriment of others. Some will use that as a food source, and they just go way up quick. And the others, not so good. It doesn't kill microorganisms. None of these do, surprisingly. This is a buried or a surface drip system, and you can see what happens around emitters. The herbicides degrade rapidly, weeds come up. This is nutsedge. Okay, environmental factors, and when you apply these, because you're always worried about drift, you want to avoid doing it during windy conditions. How about when it's raining? Is that a good idea to apply herbicides when it's raining? Surprisingly, unless it's displacing the pattern, the spray pattern, it's okay, because you want to move it into the soil anyway for a pre-emergence herbicide, and so it doesn't really matter. But if it's so hard to rain that your spray pattern is no longer a pattern, it's being knocked all over the place, then it's probably not a good idea. But I like to apply it either right before rain or during a real light rain. Works fine. Temperature, not really a factor, other than potentially volatilizing. Post-emergence. This is probably the stuff you're most familiar with, because Roundup, as the example. Roundup's the example I use most. Has to be not absorbed, but absorbed. There's an R should be there. Absorbed into the weed to be effective. And this is where the rainfall that you just said, because everybody's heard the Roundup, you know, rain safe in an hour. Basically, you need to keep the water off these. You don't want to put them on and then start your sprinklers, because it just washes it off. It's no longer effective. So it needs to be absorbed into the plant, and so the longer the dry period, the better. Seedlings are a lot easier than big plants. They have to be actively growing. And this was one of the harder concepts for me to understand. Why do they have to be actively growing? Suck it down into the roots. But I always thought, when do you get sick? It's when you're stressed, when you're tired, when you're maybe not as active. And so I always thought, when the plant's stressed, boy, then we can really nail it. Well, it's just as this lady's pointed out here, that basically it has to be actively growing because it's absorbed and then has to be moved to wherever it exerts that toxic effect. And if it's not actively growing, things aren't moving. And so that's why it has to be good conditions and then rain-free.
You put a little bit of dishwashing soap in with it to help break down the oils on the leaves so it will get in there faster.
The comment was they heard that if you put a little bit of dish soap in, it'll help break down the oils, leaves, and get in a little faster. The old formulation of Roundup allowed you to do that, to put in surfactant, which is a soap, into it, and it would help get a little bit better activity. The new label, the way it's written, you're not allowed to put anything in except ammonium sulfate, and that works to improve the efficacy. But there'll be a whole lot more since it's off patent now, a whole lot of different formulations, and the dish soap thing is not such a bad idea. Ivory or something like that. There's certain ones that work better than others. Okay, water volume again is important. Yearly timing, and I'm going to get to that when it comes to the blackberry or poison oak or some of the other perennials, and then other methods. And I'll talk about all those things. When do you make your application? Well, what is this weed here? For one thing. What is it? Any other guesses? Because that ain't it. Star thistle. Now, how many people don't know star thistle as a seedling? I mean, it's amazing. You know, it looks pretty innocuous then. All this, everything you see that's green is yellow star thistle. There's nothing else but star thistle in this picture. And even these things, these little tufts there, are last year's plants. I thought that would give it away. But seedlings are kind of hard to tell. I mean, it's just one of these little green seedlings. It doesn't have the spines yet, but that's star thistle. When do you want to make your application of, say, Roundup? You want to get it when it's small, but yet you don't want to do it too early because another flush will come. And so you've got to sort of weigh your options there of doing it at such a time to get most of the plants that are going to emerge already emerged, but not so big that you can't do a good job. And this is why. When they're real big, imagine this being, say this is life size here. Well, you spray those plants, and you come back about 2 weeks later, and it almost looks like you've done nothing. Because sure enough, you've killed these plants, but they've acted like an umbrella for all these little ones underneath it, and those come right back up through it. And so spraying when it's big oftentimes is not as effective as spraying when they're small. These little arrows here show the CO2 that's fixed in plants by photosynthesis moves in the plant to the growing points. And that's the same way that herbicides, translocated herbicides, are moved within the plant in that same manner. They're moved along with the sugars in a plant. That's why I put those arrows there. Now, they also say in Roundup and other labels 10 to 40 gallons per acre. And people always ask, well, how much should I use? The same thing with the pre-emergence as post-emergence. Real low vegetation like this, just use the minimum amount, 10 gallons. Again, why do you want to carry a whole lot of water? And what's the advantage? There's no advantage to using a greater amount of water. And oftentimes there's advantage to using less, because if it's hard water, what's the water hardness here? Is it really hard? In our area, it's about 550 parts per million calcium carbonate equivalents, which is extremely hard water. When it's really hard water, the less water you use, the less tie-up of the herbicide you have. And so if you can get cleaner water, that's ideal. If it's real hard water, always use the lowest volume you could use, because the more hard water molecules, the more Roundup or some of these other herbicides actually attach and become ineffective. And so that's another reason to use clean water or low volumes. However, if you got real tall vegetation, to get coverage, you've got to use higher volumes. And that's where you want to use the higher volumes, say the 40 gallons instead of the 10, to get coverage of all this vegetation down into the canopy. Surfactants, soaps, things such as that, they lower the surface tension. And sometimes you're allowed to use those. For the most part, they're already built into most formulations that people are going to get as homeowners. But what they do is what you see here. They lower the surface tension. And when you have water, it beads up. And basically, you get a small area that's intersected there by the herbicide. When it's flattened out, you get much better coverage, and it gets into certain areas a lot better. Soaps do that. They lower the surface tension. Surfactants are a type of soap. Okay, timing for perennial weeds. And the comment about blackberries in October fits right into this. And I'm going to show why you want to do this at certain times and not other times. And again, the weeds have to be actively growing, and that's critical. In the spring, blackberries and other herbaceous plants, they store all their energy just below the soil surface. Trees, a lot of trees do that. Why? Why would a plant want to store it just below the soil surface? What happens when catastrophe comes along? A predator that eats the top off, or say in a tree where it's just burned by a fire, or a shrub that's burned by a fire. Well, if all your energy was stored there at the top, oh geez, you've eliminated it. But by having buds and all your energy storage just down here below the surface, it's safe from most catastrophic type events that could occur. In the spring, it's all mobilized and moved to the growing points for new top growth. Okay, you come along and you spray an herbicide right then, say on your blackberries or your poison oak, what happens? As I said before, the herbicide moves the same direction as these arrows move. You've chemically mowed the top off, but you haven't killed the plant. In the summer, well, a little bit's moved down for storage for next year, but still most of it's going for more top growth. You come along, and if a very effective herbicide on that particular weed, you can kill it sometimes, but most times not. In the fall, as this gentleman's pointed out, you apply it, it's going down in the roots for next year's growth, the poison oak, the blackberries, many plants. That's when the herbicide gets to the root system, and then you could kill it. But the key is actively growing. If you did this in August, say after 2 months of dry weather, is that plant actively growing? No way. Now, if you had a good rainfall in early August, then yeah. And I say good enough to get new growth starting to occur. That's why September, October is a good time, because oftentimes you've already had rain, it's washed off all the dust off the leaves are clean, plants are growing again, translocation down in that roots, and you could kill them. Although I will say, blackberry, poison oak, one time it's almost impossible to get a complete kill, but much more effective than if you've done it in the spring or summertime. Now, again, if you look at the Roundup label, they tell you, oh, right around flowering. Flowering's a good time, but not nearly as effective as fall. What I often do when I'm trying to kill a perennial, in the spring, summer, I'm going to cut it, do whatever I can to try to reduce that growth. In a sense, it's like the iceberg, trying to make it use up that energy in the root system. And then in the fall, I'll let it grow, and then I'll treat it then. And then I have the best chance of really knocking it out. This just shows some herbicides, spring versus fall, and how effective this is. Roundup, 2,4-D, Banville, all three herbicides. This is one of my colleagues, Dave Bear. This is 1 year after he did the treatment. So in other words, this is a perennial plant. So if you just monitor it a month later, sure, they all look dead. So you have to come back to see what did you really do. And in all cases, fall is much better than spring. But if you look at the label, spring is fine as far as they're concerned. You know, again, they're in the business of selling a product. They're not necessarily worried whether or not it works perfectly in all cases. And it'll look like it worked because the tops die off. And for most people, that gives them the impression that it worked. And this is the effect of plant stress. Stressed, non-stressed. And the same type of information you can see when that plant's not stressed controls much better than when it is stressed. Okay, the other thing, when you're dealing with pastures or vineyards or whatever, how do you decide what herbicide to use? When you go through, this is just weeds found in one vineyard, Beringer, over in Sonoma County, and you have all these weeds. How do you decide which herbicide to use when you have this many weeds? You pick the ones that are most common, and you look for susceptibility charts, such as this, that tell you, and every farm advisor office, I mean, it's on the internet, but farm advisor's office has this information. They'll tell you, you know, here's surfland and different, these are all pre-emergence, but you'll have these susceptibility charts, and they're much more inclusive than this particular chart might be. But they'll tell you which weeds it controls, don't control. And so you pick your most common weeds and look for the most C's in that particular column to figure out most complete which ones are going to work best. If you look at a label, again, they're kind of, well, yeah, it controls it, or partial control. They're not always as straightforward as a non-biased view might be. And so, again, I would use the farm advisor, Lynn, Scott, or others, Gail. You know, no? Well, okay, not Gail. But I would check, because they're going to have susceptibility tables to tell you which ones to use under what conditions. Okay, hard water. Again, the cleaner the water you can use, the more effective it's going to be. Roundup in particular is tied up by hard water something fierce. And the harder the water, the more Roundup you're going to have to take to overcome that. Because what happens when you have hard water and you put Roundup in it, it attaches and it's no longer effective. You can overcome it by just putting more and more Roundup in, but that isn't free. And so, again, the cleaner the water, the less calcium or carbonates in there, the better. Ammonium sulfate is the one chemical you can add. It's just a fertilizer. It's pretty cheap. I would always add that because that helps tie up the hard water, eliminates the effect, and you often get much quicker. Instead of seeing activity from Roundup in about a week to 3 weeks, you'll see Roundup working in about 5 days. And so it speeds the effect. And for homeowners, they like to see that quicker effect. And so I often put ammonium sulfate in. Okay, for any herbicides, make certain you know what weeds you're trying to control. One of them that the city of Davis, I've served on a committee to review their pesticide use in Davis. I'm an ecologist, and so I'm not opposed to pesticides necessarily, but I think that they need to be used properly. And so they asked me to review their use policy and their uses. Well, one of the things that I observed around my neighborhood was when they used Roundup, they put a dye in so they could see where it's been sprayed, and a blue dye. And I saw these blue spots on Malva. Cheeseweed is another common name for it, and hopefully Joe will show a picture of that a little later. But it's a pretty common weed, and I think most of you have seen it, even if you may have not heard the name. Anyway, they were spraying these plants. Well, Malva is not controlled by Roundup. And so they kept coming back, spraying and spraying and spraying, and not doing anything. So what I always tell people, if you're going to use an herbicide, follow up, make certain to see how it did or didn't do. Because one of the things you want to do is control the weeds, and if you have to keep coming back and it's not being effective, obviously you're using the wrong material. So know what weeds you have and what herbicides will work on that weed. Obviously, safety, and I usually tell people, don't use 2,4-D. And Weed Be Gone is one of those. And part of the reason, geez, it may be safe, but you hear so many horror stories about it that I have to think that maybe not. And I'm kind of sensitive to it. If I'm around it and smell it, it gives me a headache. And so I have to think, gee, that can't be really good. Most people that I work with are not affected, but I am. So I'm thinking that there's something wrong there. And so I usually tell people that's not one that I consider safe. Roundup, I think, is pretty safe.
What about when it's next to a stream?
When it's next to a stream, there is an aquatic version of Roundup called Rodeo that's pretty safe for streams, and it doesn't have the surfactants. The Roundup itself is not the problem. It's the surfactants in the Roundup that are the problem, just the soaps in a stream. If you put soaps, what happens when you put soaps in a stream? Besides the fact that it gets bubbly. The other problem is that it puts phosphates and things such as that in a stream, which for the most part you wouldn't think being too bad, but what it causes is algae growth. And algae then in turn eliminate the oxygen, which then cause an imbalance in the whole thing and some problems. Pre-emergence near a stream, the biggest example is the Mississippi River and all the corn belt and all the herbicides that have leached into the Mississippi River. And they estimate, I forget how many millions of pounds of atrazine gets into the Mississippi River every year. Well, you know, you think, well, what's the big deal? Well, it eliminates green plant material. And that's the primary source of food for the full food chain. I mean, the green plants are eaten by little critters are eaten by bigger critters, and so on down the line. You see the Mississippi River and where it empties out into the delta, and now there's like a large area you can see from satellites that doesn't have shrimp anymore. There's a lot of things that have changed. And so obviously I think keeping pesticides, some pesticides out of water is critical. Others are made to be used in water, rodeo being one of them, triclopyr being another. And so there are ones that can be used to eliminate aquatic weeds. Copper for algae is one. I didn't get into aquatic weeds too much, but for algae, copper is probably the best treatment. For some of these aquatic weeds like cattail and others, rodeo is the material of choice. And it's Roundup basically without a surfactant, and there's certain surfactants that you could use around aquatic situations that are fairly safe. If you have ponds, and I have a little pond in my backyard, a 100-gallon, I mean hardly a pond, but one of the things you want to do if you want to have plants in that pond, which is one of the reasons we have that, plant them in a pot. And so you could pull them out and eliminate everything, because sometimes these plants get a little carried away and really start growing and can cause problems. And I didn't get into any aquatic things, but if anybody has questions about aquatic weeds, I can help, or Joe, who will be talking after me, could also help you with questions on aquatic weeds, if you do have any thoughts or questions about that. Okay, the last thing is for those really tough weeds. Now, this is something that I wouldn't recommend for all homeowners, but when it just gets to wit's end, and wind, rain, temperature, you don't want to apply in a wind because it'll move. And when it moves, it kills plants next to it or close to it. Rain, don't do it in the rain. This is just the opposite of the pre-emergence, because rain washes it off. And temperature, watch out for temperature, because some herbicides can volatilize, 2,4-D being one in particular. Okay, selective methods. Sometimes you have weeds right next to another plant and you want to spray, and a lot of people like to use Roundup for this. You can use a little funnel. Now, this one was one that a friend of mine showed me, one of my colleagues, and I thought this was pretty good, but how do you know if it's working or not? I mean, with that metal funnel, how do you know if anything's coming out? I mean, you think it's coming out because it sounds like it, maybe, but you don't know. You don't know if that nozzle's clogged. What I've used is an opaque milk carton and stuck it over it, because that way you could see, like a 1-gallon thing, and just use duct tape around it, and that way you could see it coming out. You just stick it down to the ground, and you could treat areas right next to a sensitive plant.
2-liter bottle works well too.
2-liter, yes. That's what I use, is a 2-liter. Yeah, just cut it off the bottom, and that works pretty well. Another thing that I've done, say you have field bindweed or perennial morning glory in a flower bed. How do you get rid of that chemically? Well, what I've done is I pulled it up, stuck newspapers all over my plants, set it there, and just sprayed it with and what I use is like a Windex bottle, and I'll label it with a skull and crossbones. Even though Roundup is not toxic, you don't want anybody potentially drinking this. Windex would probably be enough to let people know you don't want to drink Windex either. But anyway, I still label it poison, even though that's not, I mean, you could drink Roundup and it wouldn't kill you. It's not that toxic. You would have to drink, Windex would kill you quickly compared to Roundup. But anyway, I still don't like the idea of anybody potentially having pesticides in a container and not marked as pesticides. But I'll spray all the newspapers there, and I'll spray the bindweed with this little solution of Roundup, and then I'll let it sit there and make certain it dries. Then I can take the papers out. Then the herbicide is moved into the root system, and I could kill it in a situation where you have a lot of sensitive plants around it.
Does Roundup lose its potency if you mix up a batch and store it for a period of time?
No. Most pesticides do. Roundup does not. And that's one of the few. And that's why they could sell it in these Roundup Ready type things, you know, that you could buy. It doesn't lose its potency, but some do lose potency when they're mixed and left in storage. The other thing that happens, even if they don't lose their potency, they settle out. And so what happens, kind of have a good story about that too. When I was, my first job out of school was assistant professor at Penn State. And when I went there, one of my first trials, I hadn't done any of these herbicide trials or anything to speak of as a grad student. And so I was doing this herbicide trial. It was with this powder type formulation that I didn't realize would settle out. And so I mixed this batch, and then I had lunch, and it settled. And anyway, I went to put this plot out and sprayed it, and came back, and I had 3 feet of absolute scorched earth and then 100 feet of nothing. And I realized then It all settled out. The sump is at the bottom. And pull this up. I sprayed everything out in the first 3 feet and killed everything, and then 100 feet of water. And so some herbicides settle out, where Roundup is actually water soluble, and so it mixes very well and will stay in solution without any problem. But most herbicides, when you mix it, you want to spray it. And even Roundup, I spray it and then I empty everything out and rinse it out, put the water around plants I want to kill. I don't pour it down the drain because, again, I'm a fisherman. I mentioned that right at the beginning. And the last thing I want to do is pollute any stream or waterway because I love to fish. If anybody has fishing questions, I can answer those as easily as weed questions. Okay, another thing. What happens when you want to get rid of a tree? Say you have a willow tree. You ever cut down a willow tree? What happens? You got 50 of them coming up. How do you kill that willow tree or the pyracantha in this particular case, or any of these other things that are big resprouters? You cut it here, and this is a 2,4-D formulation, but it doesn't matter. It could be Roundup. I cut it, and right away I paint it on full strength, not diluted. This. You can dilute it half and half, but full strength it works pretty good too. Yes?
Will that work for Tree of Heaven?
I'm sure it will. And Joe has actually worked on Tree of Heaven, the next speaker, so he can answer that, but I'm positive it'll work on Tree of Heaven. Yes? Right away, yes. The key is putting it on right away, because if you don't put it on right away, it sort of saps up and seals over, and you don't get the movement. You've got to cut it and right away be ready to just paint it on. And that's the key to this cut stump method. But this will kill a tree with very little pesticide, whereas if you tried to spray that tree or shrub or whatever, you've got to use a ton of material to get the same effect, and it's still not as effective as treating the stump like this. This just shows, you know, basically the cambial layer, the outside layer, is really where you want to put the pesticide. In the center of the heartwood, you don't really need to put it there. So it's just really right around the edge. But for the most part, when it's small like that, I just tell them paint the top. You know, blackberry or smaller trees, shrubs, manzanita, things such as this. Obviously, I always tell people, try to use it in combination with things. Don't rely on pesticides to solve all your problems. When you have, as an example, you eliminate, say, blackberry, or you eliminate any other weed. If you don't do anything to keep other weeds coming out, you'll just have another problem right after that. Put a mulch over it, or put new plants that you do want in there. And then avoid bare spots, because that's the hardest to keep under control. That's the key to that one. That's it. Is that for being done early?
The preceding program was part 1 of 2 parts, each 90 minutes long. There is support material available at this website, including quizzes, handouts, and lecture outlines for all presentations. Consult the UCTV programming guide for the date and time part 2, and other lectures in the series will be shown.
It's the definitive guide to gardening, produced by the University of California. The California Master Gardener Handbook is available along with other gardening publications on the A&R Catalog website at anrcatalog.ucdavis.edu.